Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get week 19 underway with another Mailbag Monday. Justin R. writes in, asking an interesting question about Christopher Tolkien's work. Why is the History of Middle-earth collection structured the way it is? Specifically, Justin asks, why do the first few volumes deal with the Silmarillion, then the next set of volumes deal with the Lord of the Rings, and then the final volumes go back to covering the Silmarillion? And in addition, why did Christopher Tolkien leave out a volume or two on The Hobbit from his History of Middle-earth project? Well, this is a really interesting question, or set of questions, to be honest, and the answers lie, for the most part, in Christopher's own words. In various volumes of the History of Middle-earth, in the preface to Bitten and Luthien, and more. But before we go to 1983 and the publication of The Book of Lost Tales Part 1, that's Volume 1 of the History of Middle-earth, let's go back to a letter that Christopher wrote to Rainer Unwin, the once-upon-a-time 10-year-old boy who reviewed The Hobbit in 1936, but who by 1968 was the chairman of Tolkien's publisher, Allen and Unwin. So the year is 1981. Christopher Tolkien had published his edition of the Silmarillion 4 years prior, in 1977, and Unfinished Tales just the year before. Now, Christopher had continued working on his father's earlier manuscripts and was preparing a volume called The History of the Silmarillion. When he wrote to Rainer in 1981, that book was 16 and a half inches across and was already 1,968 pages long. He writes to Rainer, "If and or when you see this book, you will perceive immediately why I have said that it is in no conceivable way publishable. The textual and other discussions are far too detailed and minute. The size of it is, and will become progressively more so, prohibitive. It is done partly for my own satisfaction in getting things right, and because I wanted to know how the whole conception did in reality evolve from the earliest origins. If there is a future for such enquiries," Christopher continues, "I want to make as sure as I can that any later research into J.R.R. Tolkien's literary history is not turned into a nonsense by mistaking the actual course of its evolution. The chaos and intrinsic difficulty of many of the papers, the layer upon layer of changes in a single manuscript page, the vital clues on scattered scraps found anywhere in the archive, the texts written on the backs of other works, the disordering and separation of manuscripts, the near or total illegibility in places, is simply inexaggerable." You can see here that Christopher's passion is for these early stories of the legendarium, and especially for the great tales, which fortunately he would not only address in History of Middle-earth, but would eventually publish full standalone versions of each of those three: The Children of Húrin in 2007, Beren and Luthien in 2017, and The Fall of Gondolin in the following year, 2018. But back to the History of Middle-earth. In the foreword to the Book of Lost Tales Part 1, again, that's the first volume in the series, Christopher points out that, as has now been fully recorded, my father greatly desired to publish the Silmarillion together with the Lord of the Rings. I say nothing of its practicability at the time, nor do I make any guesses at the subsequent fate of such a much longer combined work. But by its posthumous publication nearly a quarter of a century later, the natural order of presentation of the whole matter of Middle-earth was inverted. And it is certainly debatable whether it was wise to publish in 1977 a version of the primary legendarium, standing on its own and claiming, as it were, to be self-explanatory. The published work, and here he's talking about the Silmarillion in 1977, has no framework, that is, no frame narrative like the Lord of the Rings, no suggestion of what it is and how, within the imagined world, it came to be. Christopher says, "This I now think to have been an error." Now note that he's not saying that publishing the Silmarillion was an error. It was doing it without giving it a frame narrative that was the error. His decision to publish the Book of Lost Tales, in 2 parts because of its length, appears to have been an effort to correct that error. Now that explains the focus on the Silmarillion and many of Tolkien's early writings in the first volumes of the History of Middle-earth. But why switch to the Lord of the Rings starting in Volume 6? Well, for that, let's go to the foreword to The Return of the Shadow. Christopher explains that many of the manuscript pages he had intended to provide to Marquette University, that is to say, that his father intended to provide. Marquette had purchased the manuscripts and typescripts to The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, as well as Farmer Giles of Ham and Mr. Bliss. Those manuscripts had remained in his father's possession instead and had passed to Christopher after Tolkien's death. He had, in his own words, neglected them for many years as he was focused on the elder days. In fact, he writes in 1988, the publication of Volume 3 of the History of Middle-earth was already approaching before I had any idea that the history might extend to an account of the writing of the Lord of the Rings. During the last 3 years, however, I have been engaged at intervals in the decipherment and analysis of the Lord of the Rings manuscripts in my possession, a task still far from completed. In other words, when he started, he didn't know he'd be going there. He reiterates this in the foreword to the last volume in the series, The Peoples of Middle-earth, that was published in 1996. He says that his work began indeed as an entirely private study, without thought or purpose of publication. Later, when Rainer Unwin, to whom I am greatly indebted, undertook the uncertain venture of publishing my work on the history of the Silmarillion, in form necessarily much altered, I had no intention of entering into the history of the later ages. The inclusion of the Lost Road, the drowning of Anadune, the Notion Club papers, and above all, the history of the writing of the Lord of the Rings, extending the work far beyond my original design, was entirely unforeseen. Now, the challenge is that this only answers the first two parts of Justin's question. Why did the history of Middle-earth focus on the Silmarillion and early writings first, and then switch to the Lord of the Rings? And so, for the first time on a Mailbag Monday, we'll have to answer the rest of Justin's questions, why switch back to the Silmarillion and why no Hobbit, next week. But that wraps it up for Mailbag Monday this time. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please email it to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Let them know it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to patrons of the show, of course. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, mail priority, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a whole lot more. Finally, join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday, as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe on your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.